Over the course of the summer here in Brentford, we've been walking through some of the shorter books in the Old Testament, the prophets that God sent to speak to his people. So this morning we're looking at Zephaniah. If you have difficulty finding it, you are not alone. Your friend in this is the contents page at the start of the Bible. If you could look up Zephaniah, it's page 788 in the church Bibles. If you struggle to find it, just use the contents page. We're going to cover the whole book this morning. I'm going to read a few verses from the start, from the middle, and from the end, and then we'll refer to other verses as we go through. Starting from Zephaniah 1 and verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will sweep away man and beast. I will sweep away the birds of heaven, the heavens, the fish of the sea, and the rubble with the wicked. I will cut off from mankind from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place the remnant of Baal and the name of the idolatrous priests, along with the priests, those who bow down on the roofs to the host of heaven, those who bow down and swear to the Lord and yet swear to Milcom, those who have turned back from following the Lord, those who do not seek the Lord or inquire of him. And then forward to the first 5 verses of chapter 3. Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the oppressing city. She listens to no voice. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. Her officials within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves that leave nothing till morning. Her prophets are fickle, treacherous men. Her priests profane what is holy. They do violence to the law. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no injustice. Every morning he shows forth his justice. Each dawn he does not fail, but the unjust knows no shame. And then from verse 9 to the end. For at that time I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord. For from beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. On that day you shall not be put to shame because of the deeds with which you have rebelled against me. For then I shall remove from your midst your proudly exultant ones. You shall no longer be haughty in my holy mountain, but I will leave in your midst a people humble and lowly. They shall seek refuge in the name of the Lord. Those who are left in Israel, they shall do no injustice and speak no lies, nor shall there be found in their mouth a deceitful tongue. For they shall graze and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. On that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear not, O Zion. Let not your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exult over you with loud singing. I will gather those of you who mourn for the festival, so that you will no longer suffer reproach. Behold, at that time I will deal with all your oppressors. I will save the lame and gather the outcast. I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time I will bring you in, at the time when I gather you together, for I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord. This is God's word. Let's pray and then consider what God says. Loving Father, we thank you for your good word, though it is sometimes difficult to hear and sits uncomfortably with us. We pray that by the end of hearing your word preached this morning, we might think of Jesus and sing a rejoicing song. In his name, amen. What is it that gives you hope? When you look around and feel like the world has gone to hell in a handcart, what is it that reassures you that things will be all right in the end? When you feel like something in your own life isn't going the way you hope it would, when you feel sometimes that it is falling apart, if your relationships are not working out, when your job is under threat, when your company is struggling, when you have money troubles, when you've done something that you regret and you are despairing, where do you turn? When we look for hope, we tend to look for two things: power and certainty. Power to overcome whatever the bad thing is that's going on, and certainty that the thing will work. It's why politicians weave hope through their campaigns. It may be bad now, but have hope. I have the right plans to reverse your financial troubles, or whatever the policy is, and I am confident that I am the man to do it. It's why we are somewhat apt to fall for scams, or when we fall in love with the next big thing. We are given hope that whatever the thing is will cure our ailments, whether it is NFTs making us money, AI meaning that we can turn up to the office and put our feet up, right back to days of old when the Victorians went crazy over ether, thinking it would fix all of their problems. We buy into the promise that something has the power to reverse the bad, and certainty that the troubles that we have are at an end. That is what gives us hope: power and certainty. Over the summer, as I said, we're going through some of the smaller books in the Old Testament. And this morning, as we look at Zephaniah, we hear something of what it means to be given hope. Zephaniah was a prophet. He was responsible for explaining God's covenant, God's relationship to God's wayward people. He was alive about 2.5 millennia ago. His book only adds up to about 3 chapters. You can read it in about 10 fairly uncomfortable minutes. But at its heart, his book is about hope. What gives us hope for eternity when everything has fallen apart? His answer isn't exactly what you and I would want to hear initially, but it is God's truth, and it is relevant for you and I. For those younger folks, there are 3 big words to look out for this morning as we go through. The words are danger, pride, and singing. Danger, pride, and singing. So look out for those words. So the 3 sort of strands, we'll touch on various verses throughout Zephaniah. You can go away and read it yourself later on and make sure that I wasn't making it up. But we're going to pick out 3 strands in his message. And the first one is this: you are in more danger than you could possibly imagine. You are in more danger than you could possibly imagine. Zephaniah is writing to God's special people about 6 centuries before Jesus was born. 300 years before Zephaniah's day, God's special people who had their own country, their own nation, had been broken up. They had a civil war, and they broke up into 2 separate nations. And then a century before Zephaniah was speaking and writing, one of those 2 nations was invaded. They were taken over by the superpower of the day, and they basically don't exist anymore by this stage. The remaining part of God's people, Judah, are who Zephaniah is speaking to in these verses. And about 50 years after Zephaniah's day, they themselves were also invaded. They were taken over by the Babylonians. And at the time that Zephaniah is speaking and writing, Judah is in a pretty desperate state. The people of God, they were meant to be special. They were meant to show the world what God is like. They had forgotten the God who'd rescued them, the God who'd brought them out of slavery in Egypt, the God who'd given them their own country, the God who had formed a relationship with them and guaranteed them blessings that would last forever if they trusted him. At this point in history, Judah has a teenage king. Sorry, I just lost my page. There we go. Judah had a teenage king. He was somewhere between about 9 and 18 at this point, probably. And they were surrounded by countries who seemed powerful, who seemed influential, and countries who were constantly baring their teeth at Judah. The best bet seemed to be in the day to ally themselves with the countries around them. There was Cush, who are mentioned several times in this book, is somewhere in the region of South Sudan and Ethiopia today. They were incredibly wealthy. They had huge amounts of wealth and therefore were very influential. There was Nineveh, which is in modern-day Iraq. They housed the most vicious army that the ancient Near East had ever seen. They still carried a threat that had destroyed the other part of God's people a century before. There was the Philistines, the one that the giant Goliath came from. There was Ashdod, Ashkelon, Moab, Ammon. All around God's people were countries who could flatten them, were merchants who could buy and sell them, were enemies who could threaten their very existence. And their own king is busy battling acne and growing pains. God's people are weak and they are vulnerable. But that is not the risk that Zephaniah draws their attention to. The big problem that Judah has, Zephaniah says, is God's anger against his own people. God promises through Zephaniah that Judah don't have to worry about the Assyrians. They don't have to worry about the Cushites or the Moabites or the Philistines because their own God is going to wipe them out. The language in the opening verses is pretty extreme, is pretty overwhelming and uncomfortable. Verse 2 of chapter 1, I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth. And he goes on to reiterate that again and again. God is warning his special people that he is their most dangerous enemy. He promises complete and comprehensive destruction for Judah. Over the last couple of weeks, we were on holiday. And Rue and Gus and I walked a section of the Fife Coastal Path. So there's a section that goes through sort of dunes and forests and along the beach on the east coast of Scotland. And as you walked the stretch that we went along, there was quite a lot of ruined buildings there. So some of them were former World War II structures designed to stop invasion on the coast. Some of them were stations from a branch line of the East Coast Railway line that was closed in the 60s. Some of them were old shepherd huts. And each of them were now nothing more than bricks piled on top of each other. They weren't usable anymore for their purpose. You could tell they were buildings, but they weren't usable. But even those buildings still had the bricks piled on top of each other. You could tell what they used to be. You could see the shape of them and what they were used for. That is not what will be left after God has dealt with his special people. That is what Zephaniah says. Even the rubble will get swept away. There'll be nothing left. There'll be nothing to tell what was once there, that God's special people once lived here. What is going to happen, in Zephaniah's words, is more extreme than even the flood that Noah escaped from in the ark. There will be nothing left. What we read about in Zephaniah is not an indiscriminately angry God. If you've seen the most recent Thor movie, apart from the fact it's not a particularly great exhibit of high art, there is a point in the movie where Zeus, who's the king of the Greek gods, meets the hero and he's offended. His pride gets hurt. And so he starts throwing around lightning bolts in a kind of fit of pique. What Zephaniah is describing is not that. This is not an arbitrarily angry God. This is a God who has been personally offended by his own people. Throughout the book, Zephaniah uses God's relationship name. If you see in the verses the word Lord with capital letters, that is God's special relationship name that he has given just to his people. This is God's anger against his own people for ignoring him. They have walked away from the God they're meant to cherish, the relationship that he has bought for them. It means that God is talking to people who know God personally, who have experience of him. These people who have tasted God's goodness have decided he's not worth it anymore. They have outgrown him. The heart of what they've done is in verse 17 of chapter 1. Zephaniah says, I will bring distress on mankind. so that they shall walk like the blind, because they have sinned against the Lord, capital letters, God's relationship name. Their blood shall be poured out like dust. The word in the middle there is they have sinned against the Lord. Their offense is that they've broken relationship with their relationship-making God. By the end of chapter 2, the full seriousness of the danger is unveiled. Everyone will be totally ended. The day of the Lord is coming, is the way that Zephaniah describes it. It will be a day of God's anger and a day of anguish for God's people. A day when God rides out in battle against people who he has rescued and who have then treated him as worthless. It's a day that's inevitable. It's definitely coming. It is inescapable. It's a day when the things that God's people have invested in will no longer be under their control. They will no longer get shelter from their homes. They will no longer get nourishment from their foods. They will no longer retrieve food from their farms. The problem that Zephaniah opens up over the course of a chapter and a half is that God's people have tasted relationship with him and then moved on, decided there's something better. They've treated him as not worth anything, but from a position of knowledge. And it puts them in mortal peril. Zephaniah's picture of the danger that God's people are in is stark and it's uncomfortable. I would prefer just to preach on the last few verses of Zephaniah. That would be more comfortable for me. But that is not the weight of what Zephaniah says in his book. It's not a picture that we like to paint of God, but what is true of God at any point in history is true of God in all of history. God doesn't change. He is not somehow one God in the Old Testament, angry and capricious, grumpy, liable to fly off the handle, and then a delightful grandfather by the time that the New Testament rolls around. The God that's depicted in these verses cares deeply about the relationship he has established with his people. And when his people choose to walk away from him, that matters. What Zephaniah is proclaiming here, 630 years ahead of Jesus, is echoed in the book of Romans in the New Testament by Paul. Every single one of God's people has chosen anarchy, chosen chaos, chosen to ignore God, to dethrone the King of the universe, to sin. That is what sin means, to put ourselves as King of the universe instead of God. And what Paul says in Romans is that the wages of sin are death. That is what Zephaniah says here. It's what Paul says in the New Testament. Treating relationship with God as optional earns nothing more or less than God's anger. God's anger places us in the worst danger imaginable because the commander of the full army of heaven has become our enemy. The hand that crafted galaxies, the hand that poured water into the deepest sea trench, the precision eye which places atoms on top of each other, the strength that powers every gust of wind and every comet streaking through the solar system, that is turned against the person who has known God and decided he's no longer worthy of our time. We are in greater danger than we can possibly imagine. That's Zephaniah's first message. But what does that actually look like? What does it look like to ignore God? What does a sin from verse 17 mean? What is the character of the people who've inspired this anger in God? Well, the second thread is this, that your pride has turned God's design upside down. Your pride has turned God's design upside down. The kings of God's people, their job right from the start was to fight the enemies of God's people, to defend God's people from harm. When the first of the kings was put in place for God's people, King Saul, and then again with his successor, King David, they were told that their job was to defend God's people, to keep them safe to worship God. But instead, what is it these kings are doing? In verse 8, Zephaniah writes, I will punish the officials and the king's sons and all who array themselves in foreign attire. The kings are wearing the same clothes as their enemies. It's not just about fashion. It's about the king saying, I ally myself with Moab, with Cush, with Assyria, with God's enemies. The kings are not interested in being the rescue leaders they're meant to be. in defending God's people. They're more interested in pretending that they are just an outpost of the Philistines. The prophets were meant to speak God's truth. They were meant to screw down what God's covenant said into the hearts of his people. But instead, what is it the prophets do? In verse 12 of chapter 1, they are complacent. They say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. By chapter 3 and verse 4, he calls the prophets fickle and treacherous. These prophets are not interested in speaking what's true. They love to speak, but they use the influence of their voice to tell people that God is irrelevant. He's not part of the world anymore. Don't pay him any heed. They offer a covenant to God's people, but they offer a covenant that's anemic, that's about what makes for easy listening and comfortable living. It's a covenant of comfort, not of the living God. The prophets care nothing for truth and are untrustworthy. They offer words that fade away at the first sign of challenge. The hearers are left in danger, like a bridge that's built of sticks that collapse when the first car drives over it. And the priests, they were meant to help God's people stay close to God, to live out in obedience God's law. But instead, by verse 4 of chapter 3, Zephaniah says, her priests profane what is holy. They do violence to the law. They corrupt what's already godly. Each morning they get up and they set out to dismantle what God commands, not to reinforce it, not to help God's people obey. The people of God have chosen as their officers of justice people who value violence. The people here are people who've learned not to listen when God speaks. There are people who are rebellious, are people who are used to hearing God's voice and have come to value hearing but not responding. This is a church that welcomes ideas that make God small and us big. It is a church that values sitting comfortably with the world around it more than what is true. It is a church that values what I want more than what God says. In The Magician's Nephew, which is chronologically the first of the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis describes this sort of behavior. So by midway through the book, Aslan, the lion, is singing Narnia into existence. It's a creation story. And he describes one of the characters not liking what's happening. He's describing Uncle Andrew here. He says this: when the great moment came and the beasts spoke, Uncle Andrew missed the whole point, and for a rather interesting reason. When the lion had first begun singing, long ago, when it was still dark, he'd realized that the noise was a song, and he had disliked the song very much. It made him think and feel things he did not want to think and feel. Then, when the sun rose and he saw that the singer was a lion, only a lion, he said to himself, he tried his hardest to believe that it wasn't singing and never had been singing, only roaring as any lion might in a zoo in our own world. Of course, it can't really have been singing, he thought. I must have imagined it. I've been letting my nerves get out of order. Who ever heard of a lion singing? And the longer and more beautifully the lion sang, the harder Uncle Andrew tried to make himself believe that he could hear nothing but roaring. Now, the trouble about making yourself stupider than you really are is that you very often succeed. Uncle Andrew did. He soon did hear nothing but roaring in Aslan's song. Soon he couldn't have heard anything else, even if he'd wanted to. And when at last the lion spoke and said, "Narnia, awake," he didn't hear any words. He only heard a snarl. When the beasts spoke in answer to Aslan, he heard only barkings, growlings, baying, and howling. Lewis, in that section, captures the problem of Zephaniah's people at the time. The kings had come to love assimilation with God's enemies, looking like everybody else and not defending God's people from the enemies. The prophets speak death-bringing, treacherous, and unchallenging comfortable lies and not life-giving truth. The priests take what is godly and make the godly things horrible and grimy and putrid. God's people have learned not to hear when the God who loves them, who has saved them, speaks. They love, in C.S. Lewis's terms, making themselves stupider. And so now they only hear the growls and bayings, the barkings and howlings. The heart of sin is taking what God says and turning it upside down. The pride of believing that we know better than God. It is precisely what's put the people of Judah at this point in time in danger. And it's precisely what you and I do all the time. We love to ignore the one who's made us. We love pretending that God is irrelevant. That in Zephaniah's words, he is neither doing good nor evil. He is irrelevant. And by this point, we need somewhere to hide when danger comes, because that is what our hearts look like. By the start of chapter 2, Zephaniah tells his hearers that the only hope is to run to the God who is angry and ask for his protection instead. Shot through the bleak and uncomfortable prophecy, which offers power and certainty for sure, but not relief, not something that gives us true hope, there comes this vein of good hope instead. And Zephaniah's final message is this: God sings salvation so that you can sing forever. God sings salvation so that you can sing forever. In the bowels of the warnings and the punishment promised, in the midst of chapter 2, Zephaniah gives an inkling that there is hope. In verse 6, he suggests that there will be a people who survive the threat that he's been speaking about. You, O seacoast, shall be pastures with meadows for shepherds and folds for flocks. The seacoast shall become the possession of the remnant of the house of Judah, the people who've survived, and on which they will graze. And in the house of Ashkelon they shall lie down at evening, for the Lord their God will be mindful of them and restore their fortunes. I've heard the taunts of Moab, the revilings of the Ammonites, how they taunted my people and made boasts against their territory. By the time, if you read the book from start to finish, you reach the middle of chapter 3, we should be wondering how anyone could possibly survive. All of our hearts are so like Uncle Andrew's that we couldn't get back in God's good books even if we wanted to. We couldn't hear him speak even if we wanted to. But the twist in the closing verses that we read at the start, from verse 9 to the end of the book, is this: God does it all himself, and he does it on our behalf. God does this and not us. The picture that Zephaniah paints is that God sings over his people. He sings a song of salvation, a song of rescue. The heart of the resolution is in verse 15 of chapter 3. You read it with me. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. And how has he done that? The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. The king that God's people really need is in the midst, is right there with us. And who is that king? The King of Israel, the Lord, capital letters, relationship-making God, is with us. The one who is angry with us has taken away our judgments. He is the one who clears away our enemies. The relationship-making, promise-keeping, covenant God is in the middle of his people. The king who does what a king is meant to, who removes the enemies of God's people, who defends them from what threatens them. God himself is the king, right in the mess and the chaos and destructiveness that his people have left. Putting the king among the chaos means that no one in his people need ever be worried about the effects of sinful rejection of God ever again. We are defended against the worst enemy by God himself. God fixes our problem by being in the middle of our mess. King Josiah, who's mentioned in the first verse, the teenage king, he wasn't the king that would make this happen properly. For a few years, he does actually turn things around. He hears what Zephaniah and some of the other prophets of the day say, and he turns things around. He leads God's people well for a few years. They begin to trust God again after this prophecy for a few years. But Josiah was just a glimpse of what really lay ahead. The problem was only fixed when God himself became the king. That is who Jesus is. That is the rest of the Bible story, helping us to see that God himself chooses to be in the middle of his people. The king that we need but have yet never had. The king who enters into our chaos. The king who commands all of the armies of heaven and yet quietly accepts death so that his people live forever. In verse 18, Zephaniah says, I will gather those of you who mourn for the festival so that you will no longer suffer reproach. Behold, at that time I will deal with all your oppressors. I will save the lame, gather the outcast. I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. The king is mighty and so is able to save in a way that no human can. The king deals with oppressors, heals physical ailments, he remedies isolation, he restores tattered reputation, he addresses every tear of mourning that any of us have ever cried. The people listening to Zephaniah, they saw a dull shadow of this in Josiah's leadership, but in 50 years they'd returned to their own ways and were in exile. We know, though, the end of the story. We know that God keeps his promise through Jesus. For when God sends his own son, the king we need, Jesus enters into our midst. Jesus' obedience does what the priests cannot do and keeps God's commands perfectly. His words do what the prophets refused to do and speak the truth that brings life. And because of that, when God looks at the people of the king, the people who know their utter inadequacy, who require mercy from God's hands and not justice, when God looks at those people, at you and I, if we stake our eternity on Jesus, humble, relying on the king that he sent, King Jesus, at that point, God sees not our failure, not our sin and rebellion, and treats us with the anger that we deserve, but instead sees the king and treats us with the favor that he deserves. He looks at you and sees the king. He rejoices over you with singing. He sings salvation's song over your broken and messed up heart, over your inadequacy, over your failure, over your sinfulness, your weakness, your decision to ignore God. He sings over you. That is the picture that Zephaniah paints. He rejoices over you because he looks at you and sees King Jesus. That's what we have celebrated this morning with Oliver's baptism. He looks at Oliver and sees King Jesus. When I stake my eternity on this King Jesus, the chaos melts away. God sings over me. And that should cause us to respond with what Zephaniah says in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 3. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. It's a way of saying God's people. Daughter of Zion, Israel, daughter of Jerusalem are all ways of saying God's people. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. Let's pray.